It was a late summer evening, the kind that felt heavy with warmth even after the sun had slipped behind the rooftops. The air was still, carrying the faint smell of rain from earlier that day. The streets were quiet, just the hum of distant traffic and the buzz of streetlights waking up one by one. A man named David sat behind the wheel of his silver sedan, heading home after a long day at work. His shirt collar was slightly wrinkled, his eyes tired but calm. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local community center, and most days ended the same way, tired but content, with soft music playing on the radio and the thought of dinner waiting at home. That evening, though, something in the air felt off. Maybe it was just exhaustion, maybe not, but as he turned onto the main road, he noticed flashing blue lights appear in his rearview mirror. For a second, he thought they were meant for someone else. He slowed down, glanced around, but no, the lights stayed behind him. David sighed, his chest tightening slightly. He pulled over carefully to the side of the road and turned off the radio. He had nothing to hide. He wasn't speeding, hadn't run a light. Still, his hands trembled a little as he rolled down the window and waited. The night was quiet except for the sound of his own heartbeat and the low rumble of the patrol car pulling up behind him. The light from its headlights painted long shadows across his dashboard. He could see a figure stepping out, adjusting a belt, and walking toward his car. The officer approached slowly, one hand resting on his flashlight. He was a tall man, his face calm but unreadable. He leaned slightly as he reached the window and said in a firm, low voice, "Good evening, sir. License and registration, please." David nodded quickly. "Of course, officer," he said, reaching for his wallet. His voice was steady, but his throat felt dry. The officer's eyes followed every small movement. His flashlight beam shifted from David's hands to the car interior. The silence between them was sharp, uncomfortable. "I pulled you over," the officer said after a moment, "because your vehicle matches the description of a stolen car reported about 20 minutes ago." "Do you own this vehicle?" David blinked. "Yes, sir, it's mine. I can show you my papers." He gave a small, nervous laugh, hoping to ease the tension. "I've had this car for 3 years. The officer didn't smile. "Go ahead and get the registration from the glove box. Slowly, please." David did exactly that, slow and careful, his movements deliberate. He opened the glove box, pulled out the papers, and handed them over. The officer took them, glanced at them briefly, then stepped back toward his patrol car. As the officer walked away, David exhaled. He gripped the steering wheel, his palms damp. He'd been stopped before as small things, nothing serious, but every time it happened, the same uneasy feeling rose in his chest. Not anger, not even fear at first, just the quiet question of why me again? Minutes passed. He could see the officer sitting in his car, talking into the radio, glancing up at the sedan now and then. David tapped his fingers on the wheel to the beat of the music still faintly coming from the speakers. A part of him wanted to get out and ask what was taking so long, but he knew better. He waited, another minute, maybe 2. Then the officer's door opened again. He came back, walking faster this time, the flashlight aimed directly through the windshield. David's stomach turned. "Something wasn't right, sir," the officer said sharply. "Step out of the vehicle." David frowned. "Is there a problem?" "You have my documents. Step out of the vehicle now." His voice had changed, louder, more urgent. David froze for a second, his hand still on the wheel. Okay, he said quietly. "I'm getting out." He reached for the door handle, but before he could push it open, the officer's hand went to his holster. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked. David stopped immediately, both hands up. His heart raced so hard it almost drowned out the sound of the officer's voice. "They're up, officer." "They're up," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm not doing anything." The officer's radio crackled again. From his car, a distorted voice came through. Something about black sedan and suspect possibly armed. David couldn't make it all out, but the officer seemed to tense even more. "Turn off the engine," the officer ordered. "It's already off," David said softly. The street was empty now except for the two of them. A few porch lights flickered on in the distance, curious faces appearing behind curtains. The tension was thick, pressing against every breath David took. He wanted to explain, to say he was coming from work, to show his ID again, but he didn't want to move suddenly. He kept his hands still, resting on the steering wheel where they could be seen. The officer, still uncertain, stepped closer, shining the flashlight into every corner of the car. "What's in your right pocket?" he asked suddenly. My phone, David replied. Just my phone. Slowly take it out and place it on the dashboard. David did as told, his movements careful and deliberate. The phone's screen lit up briefly, showing a photo of his wife and little daughter. The light flickered against the glass, soft and harmless. The officer seemed to hesitate for the first time. He lowered the flashlight slightly but still looked tense. Then the radio crackled again. This time, another officer's voice came through, saying the suspect's vehicle had been sighted several miles away. The color was the same, but the license plate didn't match. The officer paused, listening. David could see the confusion cross his face. He stepped back a little, one hand still near his belt. Stay inside the car, he said quietly, though now his tone had lost some of its edge. David nodded. He didn't know what was happening anymore, only that he wanted the whole thing to be over. Another patrol car appeared at the far end of the street, lights flashing but moving slowly. David's eyes followed it, hoping that meant this nightmare was about to end. The officer's radio buzzed again. A few short words came through. Wrong vehicle confirmed. The officer exhaled, almost inaudibly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The night seemed to stretch, heavy with all the things that almost went wrong. David looked up at the man outside his window. The officer's posture had changed. Shoulders no longer stiff, flashlight now pointed toward the ground. He walked closer again, but this time his voice was low, almost apologetic. Sir, he said quietly. It looks like there's been a mistake. You're free to go. David didn't respond right away. He just sat there, still gripping the steering wheel. A dozen emotions collided inside him. Confusion, relief, anger, exhaustion. Mostly, though, he just felt small. I understand, he said finally, his voice flat. Can I go now? Yes, you can, the officer replied. I'm sorry about the misunderstanding. David nodded once, started his engine, and pulled away slowly. He didn't look back. The flashing lights faded behind him, shrinking into the distance. As he drove, his hands trembled slightly. He tried to focus on the road, on the rhythm of the tires against the asphalt, on the simple act of going home. But his mind kept replaying every second of what had just happened. The tone of the officer's voice, the sound of the flashlight tapping against the window, the way the night had suddenly turned into something that felt dangerous without reason. When he finally turned into his street, the familiar sight of his house brought a small sense of calm. The porch light was on just as it always was. Through the window, he could see his wife moving around the kitchen, probably setting the table. His daughter's laughter echoed faintly through the open window. He parked, sat there for a few seconds, and took a deep breath. Then he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes, a small cut on his hand from gripping the keys too tight, and a face that still carried a trace of disbelief. He stepped out of the car, locked it, and walked toward the front door. Every step felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of what almost happened hadn't quite left him yet. When his wife opened the door, smiling, her face softened the second she saw his expression.
Hey, she said gently.
What's wrong? He shook his head. Nothing, he whispered, forcing a small smile. Just a long day. She reached out and hugged him, and for the first time that evening, he let himself breathe fully. The warmth of home wrapped around him, grounding him again. But somewhere deep inside, a question lingered. How quickly life could shift. How a calm drive home could turn into a moment he would never forget. And as he stood there, holding his family close, the distant sound of a siren echoed again somewhere far away. He tried not to think about it, but he knew that the image of those blue lights flashing behind him would stay in his mind for a long, long time. The next morning began quietly. The sun slipped through the curtains in soft stripes, warming the room. David lay awake long before his alarm went off. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, flashes of blue light and the sharp voice of the officer echoed in his head. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a deep unease, something that lingered beneath his skin. He finally got out of bed, washed his face, and stood in front of the mirror. The reflection staring back looked the same as always, but something behind his eyes had changed. He looked tired, older somehow. He thought about how something so small, a simple traffic stop, had turned into a moment that would stay with him. In the kitchen, The smell of coffee filled the air. His wife was packing their daughter's lunch. The little girl sat at the table humming softly while drawing something with crayons. When she noticed him, she smiled brightly and waved her paper in the air. "Look, Daddy, it's you and me at the park." He smiled back, but his heart pinched a little. "That's beautiful," he said, taking the picture. It was a simple drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands under a big sun. A small red car sat beside them. He stared at it for a moment longer than he meant to. "You okay?" his wife asked softly, glancing at him as she closed the lunchbox. "Yeah," he said, placing the drawing on the counter. "Just tired." She didn't press further. She knew him well enough to see there was more he wasn't saying. Later, as he drove to work, he noticed himself checking his mirrors more often than usual. Every time a police car passed, his chest tightened slightly until it disappeared from sight. He hated that reaction. He wasn't someone who carried grudges, but the memory was still too fresh. When he reached the community center, a few of his co-workers greeted him cheerfully. He forced a smile and joined them, but his mind was elsewhere. During lunch, one of them mentioned seeing a video online of a police officer breaking a car window during a mistaken stop in another city. The words made his stomach turn. He excused himself quietly and went outside. The air felt heavy and the sky threatened rain. He sat on the steps thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong the night before. What if he had moved too quickly? What if the officer had panicked a little more? He tried not to imagine it, but the thoughts came anyway. A few days passed like that, quiet but uneasy. He didn't tell anyone about what had happened, not even his closest friends. It wasn't something he wanted to relive through words. But one evening, as he sat on the porch, his neighbor walked over, holding a phone in his hand. "Hey," the neighbor said, "I saw something strange that night, thought you should know." He handed the phone to David. On the screen was a short video clip, grainy, but clear enough to recognize. The video showed the moment the officer had raised his voice, the tense exchange that followed, and how quickly things had escalated before the backup arrived. Someone nearby must have recorded it. David's chest tightened as he watched. It wasn't a violent clip, just uncomfortable. But seeing himself in that moment, scared and trying to stay calm, made his stomach twist. "It's been shared a few times already," the neighbor said quietly. "People are talking about it." David handed the phone back. "Thanks," he said, his voice low. "I didn't even know someone was filming." That night he sat on the edge of his bed long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The sound of the video kept replaying in his head. Not because of what people might say, but because it captured how powerless he had felt in that moment. The next day, when he got home from work, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, the same officer stood there. No uniform this time, just jeans and a simple shirt. For a moment, they both froze. "Can we talk?" the officer asked quietly. David hesitated. Every instinct told him to close the door to avoid the conversation altogether. But there was something in the man's eyes, something tired, maybe regretful. He stepped aside slowly and nodded. They sat on the porch. Neither spoke for a long moment. The sound of cicadas filled the silence. "I wanted to come by and apologize in person," the officer said finally, his voice low. "I know I said it that night, but it didn't feel like enough." David didn't look at him right away. "You scared me," he said after a moment. "I did everything right and still—" He stopped, his voice catching slightly. "I know," the officer said. "You have every right to be upset. When I found out it wasn't your car, I felt sick. I keep replaying it in my head." He paused. The report that came through that night was wrong. The car's model and color matched, but the license plate didn't. "I should have checked sooner. I didn't. That's on me." David finally turned to look at him. The man sitting beside him didn't look like the one from that night. His face wasn't hard or defensive. He looked human, uneasy and full of remorse. "I've been on the job for a while," the officer continued quietly. "You get used to being on edge. You hear certain things over the radio, your training kicks in, and sometimes You stop seeing people for who they are. You just see situations. David nodded slowly, not sure what to say. He wasn't angry anymore, not exactly. Just tired. Tired of the fear. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of moments like that one even existing. After a pause, he asked, softly, "Why come here now?" The officer looked down at his hands. "Because I saw the video too," he said. "And I didn't like what I saw. Not because of how I looked, but because of what it meant. That night could have gone wrong in so many ways. I want to own that." They sat in silence for a while. The sky had turned orange as the sun dipped behind the trees. For a brief moment, the air felt still again, like it had that night. Only this time, there was understanding instead of fear. Finally, David said, "I appreciate you coming. It doesn't erase what happened, but it means something." The officer nodded, his voice quiet. "That's fair." He stood up slowly. "If you ever want to talk more, I'll listen. No badges, no uniforms, just as a person." David didn't respond immediately. He just watched as the man walked back toward his car and drove away. When the sound of the engine faded, he sat there, watching the light fade from the sky. That night, he told his wife everything, from the stop to the apology. She listened quietly, holding his hand. When he finished, she said softly, "Maybe this happened for a reason. Maybe someone needed to see that video. Maybe someone will think differently because of it." He nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure what he believed. But her words stayed in his mind. Over the next few days, messages started coming in from friends and people he didn't even know. Some thanked him for how calmly he handled the situation. Others shared their own stories, similar moments of fear, misunderstanding, and relief. He realized something then. It wasn't just his story anymore. It had become something larger, a small reflection of what many people had experienced but never talked about. One evening, he sat down at his computer and wrote a short post online. It wasn't angry or bitter, just honest. He wrote about how he had felt that night, about fear and forgiveness, and about how sometimes the hardest part wasn't what happened but what it left behind. He ended it simply. "We're all just people trying to be seen the right way." The post spread quietly, shared by strangers who connected with his words. It wasn't about blame. It was about humanity. Days later, the officer reached out again, this time through a message. He wrote, "Thank you for giving me a chance to learn from that night. I won't forget it." David stared at the message for a while before typing back, "Neither will I." He put his phone down, looked out the window at the quiet street, and finally felt something close to peace. The road ahead would still have its share of challenges, but for the first time since that night, he believed that change, real change, might actually start with moments like this. And as he sat there, watching the sky turn deep blue, the hum of the city slowly fading, he realized that sometimes healing didn't come all at once. Sometimes it started with two people facing a mistake, not as enemies, but as human beings, trying to understand each other. The days that followed brought a strange mix of calm and noise. On one side, life went on as usual. Work, errands, family dinners, the same rhythm as always. But on the other side, whispers of the story had spread through town like ripples in a pond. The video that had been recorded that night was still making its way around social media. It had been shared so many times that even people from other cities were commenting on it. Some were angry, others were surprised, and a few simply said it was one of the rare moments where a mistake didn't end in tragedy. For David, it was strange to see his own face appear on people's screens. He hadn't asked for attention and he didn't enjoy it. Still, something inside him told him that maybe this conversation, this uncomfortable but necessary one, needed to happen. At work, people started treating him differently. Some coworkers were kind and asked if he was okay. Others avoided the topic completely, unsure of what to say. One afternoon, as he was fixing a light in the hallway, a young man who volunteered at the center came up to him. "Hey," the young man said softly. "I saw that video. You handled it so calmly, man. I don't think I could have done that." David smiled faintly. "Sometimes staying calm is the only thing you can do," he replied. The young man nodded. Yeah, but still, that took a lot. After that, a few others came to him quietly, sharing their own experiences, moments where they'd been stopped or misunderstood, times when fear took over reason. Listening to them, David realized how deep this problem ran. Everyone had a story, but most were buried in silence. One evening, while sitting on the porch, he thought about the officer again. He hadn't seen him since that short visit, but the memory of their conversation lingered. There had been something honest about it, something rare. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from the police department. His hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short message thanking him for his patience and composure during a regrettable incident, and assuring him that steps were being taken to review the matter internally. He read the words twice. They sounded formal, maybe written by someone in an office, but he knew they carried weight. At the bottom there was a signature he recognized, the same officer's. That evening he sat quietly by the window, staring at the letter. His wife came over and read it too. That's something, she said softly. Yeah, he murmured, folding it neatly. It is. She looked at him for a moment, then asked, Do you believe him? He thought for a moment. I think he means it. I think he wants to change, she smiled faintly. Maybe that's the start of something good. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A community group reached out, asking if David would be willing to speak at a local town hall meeting about the importance of calm communication during tense situations. At first, he wasn't sure. He wasn't a public speaker. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about being honest. So, he agreed. The meeting was held in a modest hall not far from the center of town. Chairs were arranged neatly in rows and people filled the space. Locals, police officers, teachers, students, and families. The air carried a mix of curiosity and tension. When it was his turn to speak, he walked up to the small stage, his heart thumping. He looked at the faces in front of him, some sympathetic, some guarded, some unreadable. He took a deep breath and began. I'm not here to talk about blame, he said softly. I'm here to talk about fear. How it can change people, how it can make good people act in ways they don't mean to. I've lived long enough to know that fear can twist a moment before you even realize it. The room stayed silent. I was scared that night, he continued, but I wasn't the only one. The officer who stopped me was scared too. The difference is, I had to stay calm to survive it, and he had to learn why that fear existed in the first place. When we finally spoke, it wasn't as a driver and a cop. It was as two people trying to understand what went wrong. A few nods appeared in the crowd. Some people lowered their eyes deep in thought. I believe we can do better, he said, not by pointing fingers, but by talking, really talking, about what makes us afraid and what helps us see each other again. When he finished, the room broke into quiet applause. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was genuine. After the meeting, a few officers came up to thank him. Among them was the same man who had stopped him that night. Their eyes met, and for a second it felt like the world had paused. I didn't know you'd be here, the officer said softly. I didn't either, David replied with a faint smile. The officer nodded. What you said up there, it meant a lot. To me and probably to everyone here. I just spoke the truth, David said. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, the officer answered. They shook hands for the first time. It wasn't awkward or forced, it felt real. Around them, people continued talking, but in that small moment there was a quiet understanding that went deeper than words. After that night, something began to shift slowly in the community. The department organized a few more public discussions, inviting residents to share their stories. It wasn't perfect. There were disagreements, heated debates and tears, but for the first time, people were truly listening to one another. One afternoon, as David walked through the neighborhood, a group of teenagers waved at him from the basketball court. Hey, you're the guy from the meeting, one of them shouted. He laughed softly. Yeah, I guess I am. They asked him a few questions, curious about how he stayed calm that night. He told them the truth, that he was scared but knew reacting in anger would only make things worse. Sometimes, he said, strength isn't about fighting back. It's about staying grounded when you want to break. The boys nodded and one of them said, That's deep. It made him smile. At home, life started to feel lighter again. The laughter of his daughter filled the rooms, and the tension that had once lived in his chest began to fade. But every now and then he still thought about that night, not with anger, but as a reminder of how fragile life could be. One Sunday afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from the officer again. This time it wasn't about apologies or explanations. The message simply said, "Our department is planning a community event next month. We're inviting local residents to talk about safety, trust, and change. Would you consider helping us plan it?" He stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "Yes, I'd like that." When the day of the event arrived, the town square was filled with people, families, officers, teachers, kids playing nearby. There were booths about safety awareness, workshops on communication, even a small stage for speakers. The atmosphere was friendly, almost festive. David helped set up chairs and greeted people as they arrived. When he saw the officer again, they exchanged a nod that carried more meaning than words could. They weren't friends exactly, but they had built something better: respect. Later, as the crowd settled, the officer took the stage and spoke briefly. He didn't talk like a cop giving orders. He spoke like a person telling the truth. "I made a mistake once," he said, "and it could have cost someone their peace, maybe even their life. But that moment taught me something. Fear can blind us, but humility can open our eyes again. We can't erase what happened, but we can make sure we learn from it." The crowd was quiet. David watched from the side, proud that the man had found the courage to say those words publicly. When it was his turn to speak, he kept it simple. "Change doesn't happen in a day," he said, "but it starts when people decide to look at each other as human beings, not strangers. We all have stories and we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." That night, as he walked home, the air felt different, lighter, hopeful even. The streetlights glowed softly and the sound of laughter echoed from nearby homes. For the first time since that night, the flashing lights that had once haunted him no longer filled him with fear. They were just lights again. He looked up at the sky, whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular, and smiled. Maybe healing didn't mean forgetting. Maybe it just meant learning to move forward, together. The months passed quietly after the community event. Life began to return to its steady rhythm, though something inside had changed for the better. There was a new kind of peace in the air, fragile but real. People in town still talked about what had happened that night, but not in anger anymore. Instead, they spoke about how it led to something different: conversations, understanding, and small steps toward change. For David, that was enough. He didn't want fame or attention. He just wanted to live in a world where people could see each other as human first. At work, things had become busier. The community center had started offering new programs for the youth: sessions on communication, conflict resolution, and trust building. The idea came after the event, and to his surprise, the center asked David to help lead a few sessions. At first, he hesitated. "I'm not a teacher," he said to the director. "You don't need to be," the director replied with a kind smile. "You just need to be real. The kids will listen to you because you've lived something that matters." So he agreed. The first class was small, maybe 10 teenagers sitting in a circle, arms crossed, faces unsure. They didn't know what to expect. Neither did he. He started simply. "I'm not here to lecture you," he said. "I just want to talk about what it means to be calm when life gets loud. About what it means to stand your ground without losing your peace." At first they were quiet. Then one of the boys raised his hand. "What if people don't listen to you, no matter how calm you are?" he asked. "That's the hard part," David said softly. "Sometimes, no matter how right you are, the world won't hear you. But you can't let that change who you are. You can only control how you respond." The boy nodded, thoughtful. Another girl spoke up next. "Didn't you get scared that night?" "I did," he admitted. "More than I can explain." But fear doesn't mean weakness. It just means you care about staying alive, about making it home to your family. The strength comes when you don't let that fear turn into hate. By the end of the session, they weren't strangers anymore. They laughed, shared stories, and asked questions that showed they were really thinking. When the class ended, one of the boys lingered behind. "Thanks," he said quietly. "My brother had something like that happen to him. He still doesn't talk about it." "Maybe I'll tell him about this," David smiled. "Do that. Sometimes talking helps more than you think." As he walked home that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. The world still had its problems, but for once he felt he was doing something that mattered. Meanwhile, the officer had been on his own journey. After the event, he started volunteering for a new program the department had launched, one that paired officers with local community members for open conversations. He attended workshops, learned about bias, and started to see his work differently. It wasn't easy. Some people still looked at him with suspicion, and others criticized him for being too open. But he didn't care. He knew change didn't happen overnight. It started with honesty, and he was learning to face that every day. One afternoon, he called David. "Hey," he said when the call connected, "we're planning another town discussion next week. Would you consider coming again?" David hesitated for a moment. "What's it about?" "About forgiveness," the officer replied. "Not just mine, but in general. How communities heal after something breaks." There was silence for a moment before David answered. "All right," he said. "I'll come." The day of the event, the air felt calm. The meeting was smaller this time, just a circle of chairs inside the same hall. A few residents came, some officers, and a few members of the city council. It wasn't formal, just open conversation. When David arrived, the officer greeted him with a genuine smile. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Wouldn't miss it," David replied. As people began sharing, the stories were heavy but honest. One man talked about losing trust years ago and slowly rebuilding it. A woman spoke about how her son had been misunderstood by the system, but found hope again through mentorship. When it was David's turn, he looked around the room and said, "Forgiveness isn't saying what happened was okay. It's saying you're choosing not to let it control you anymore. It's not weakness, it's freedom." The officer nodded slowly beside him. "And sometimes," he added, "forgiveness starts with admitting you were wrong. That's how healing begins." The room stayed silent for a long time after that. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt uncomfortable. It was the kind that meant people were really listening. Later, after everyone had left, the two men stood outside the hall. The air was cool and the sky was painted in deep shades of blue. "You know," the officer said, "a year ago I wouldn't have had the courage to do this. I was too proud, too afraid of admitting I could be wrong." David smiled slightly. "Sometimes we learn the hard way. But at least you learned," he nodded. "I did. And I'll keep learning." As the weeks passed, their paths continued to cross in small ways. They worked together on local projects, school talks, safety workshops, even neighborhood cleanups. People began to see them not as opposites from a viral video, but as two ordinary men trying to make something good out of a difficult moment. One afternoon, after a school visit, they sat outside under a tree, watching children play nearby. The officer leaned back, eyes following the laughter and movement around them. "You ever think about that night now?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes," David replied. "But it feels different now." Back then it was fear, now it's a reminder. A reminder of what? That even bad moments can lead to good things if you handle them right. The officer nodded slowly. "I used to think my job was just about enforcing rules. Now I think it's about understanding people." David smiled. Maybe that's the real job after all. As time went on, news outlets reached out, wanting to interview them about their story. They said it was inspiring, a rare example of accountability and forgiveness. But both men politely declined. They didn't want it to be turned into headlines or debates. They wanted it to stay real, something for their community, not for the cameras. Still, word spread quietly. Other cities began adopting similar programs, citing their story as the spark. Letters came in from strangers across the country, messages of hope, gratitude, and reflection. Some were from officers. Some were from regular people who had once felt unseen. Each letter carried the same message in its own way. "You made me believe change is possible." One evening, after dinner, David sat on his porch with his wife. The sky was soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look gentle. She looked at him and said, "You know, you turned something painful into something good." "Not everyone can do that," he smiled. "I didn't do it alone," she nodded. "Maybe not. But you started it." He looked out at the street, watching the neighbors chatting, kids riding bikes, and the same officer driving slowly by on patrol. Their eyes met briefly, and they exchanged a simple wave, one that said more than words ever could. As the sun sank lower, he thought about everything that had happened, The fear, the mistakes, the apology, the change. Life had come full circle. He no longer saw that night as the worst moment of his life. Instead, he saw it as the beginning of something neither of them expected, a lesson in humility, in patience, and in what it truly meant to see one another. He leaned back, letting the quiet evening surround him. Somewhere down the street, laughter echoed again, blending with the distant hum of the city, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely at peace, not because the world was perfect, but because he had learned how to live in it with open eyes, open heart, and steady grace. The following months brought quiet changes, not big ones that made the news, but small, steady ones that only people close by could see. The town felt lighter somehow. People greeted each other more often. The tension that used to sit between neighbors had softened a little. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that was something worth holding on to. The man who once sat in that car on the roadside found himself living more freely now. The fear that used to tighten in his chest every time he saw flashing lights was still there sometimes, but it didn't control him anymore. He had learned to breathe through it, to let it pass. He had work to do, family to love, and a story to share that was now helping others heal. One Saturday morning, he was invited to speak at a local college. The students there had heard about his experience and wanted to understand what it felt like to live through something that had changed so many lives. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he went anyway. When he arrived, the room was full. The faces looking back at him were curious, open, and expectant. He took a deep breath and began. "I'm not here to talk about anger," he said softly. "I'm here to talk about understanding, the kind that comes after everything else." He told them the story, not in detail, but in feeling. He described the confusion, the fear, and the silence afterward. He talked about how forgiveness had felt heavier than anger at first, but how it had freed him in ways nothing else could. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Do you ever wish it didn't happen?" He paused. The room grew still. "I used to," he said, "but now I think it happened for a reason. It showed me how powerful grace can be. It also reminded me that people can change even if they want to." The students nodded, and by the end of the talk, many came up just to thank him. Some had tears in their eyes. Others just wanted to shake his hand. It wasn't about what he said. It was about what it made them feel. Later, as he was leaving, a man in uniform waited by the door. It was the same officer. He had come quietly, sitting in the back the whole time. When their eyes met, there was a shared understanding, a quiet recognition that words couldn't replace. "That was powerful," the officer said. "I just told the truth," he replied. The officer nodded. "That's exactly what people need." Over time, they grew more comfortable being seen together. What started as a strange, uncomfortable connection had turned into a partnership built on something real. They began visiting schools together, speaking to young people about patience, fear, and compassion. Their message was simple, that mistakes don't have to be the end of someone's story. The officer always spoke last. His part was humble and honest. He would say, "I can't erase what I did, but I can make sure I never repeat it. I want every person here to understand that we can only move forward when we face our failures and choose to be better." Those moments mattered. They weren't dramatic, but they changed people, little by little, word by word. One afternoon, they were invited to a larger event in the city. It was a public forum where officials, community leaders, and ordinary citizens came together to discuss rebuilding trust. The hall was packed, cameras lined the walls, and the lights felt too bright. Neither of them liked attention, but they knew this was bigger than them now. When it was his turn to speak, the man stepped up to the microphone and looked around the room. "We often talk about change like it's a big thing that happens overnight," he began. "But real change doesn't start with crowds. It starts with small choices in what you say, what you do, how you listen." He spoke about the pain of being misunderstood, but also about the peace that came when he stopped carrying resentment. The audience was silent, listening. Then the officer stepped forward. His voice shook a little at first, but he spoke from the heart. "That night will always stay with me," he said. "I made a mistake, one I can't take back. But I hope my actions since then show that I'm trying to learn, trying to do better. I want people to see that even in the hardest moments, there's room for forgiveness." When they finished, the crowd stood and clapped. Not because it was a show, but because something about it felt human, honest, and rare. Afterward, as they left the stage, a woman approached them. She was older, her eyes kind but heavy with memories. "My son went through something like that years ago," she said softly. "We never got an apology. But hearing you both today, it gave me peace." "Thank you." Her words stayed with them long after she walked away. As time passed, the story continued to spread quietly, but neither of them chased attention. They focused instead on the work, the workshops, the talks, the quiet conversations that slowly changed minds. It wasn't about one night anymore. It was about what people could do afterward. Still, life wasn't perfect. There were days when old wounds reopened, when criticism or misunderstanding found its way back into their lives. Some people thought the officer didn't deserve forgiveness. Others thought the man had been too soft. But both of them knew something those critics didn't: that healing doesn't need approval. It just needs honesty and effort. One day, the man received a letter from a teenager who had attended one of their talks. It read, "I used to hate police. I didn't even want to be near them. But after hearing your story, I realized not everyone is the same. I want to help make things better, maybe even join the force one day. Thank you for changing how I see things." He read the letter twice, quietly smiling to himself. Then he sent a photo of it to the officer with a short message. "Looks like we're doing something right." The officer replied a few minutes later, "One step at a time." Their friendship, though unplanned, had become something solid. They learned from each other, supported each other, and challenged each other to stay grounded. Sometimes they still talked about that night, not in anger, but as a reminder of where they came from. Once, during a long drive back from a community event, the officer said, "You know, I used to think about quitting after it all happened. I felt like I didn't deserve to wear the uniform." The man looked out the window, watching the road stretch into the distance. "Maybe you didn't back then," he said quietly. "But you've earned it now." The officer glanced at him, eyes soft with gratitude. "That means more than you know." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. By winter, the town had started a new initiative, one that paired community mentors with officers for local outreach. They asked both men to lead the first program together. It wasn't just symbolic. It was practical. They wanted real dialogue, real understanding, and real connection. On the first day of the program, the hall was filled with people, young and old, officers and civilians sitting side by side. The man walked to the front and smiled. "We all come from different places," he said, "but we share the same streets, the same fears, and the same hopes. Let's learn from each other instead of judging from a distance." That simple message set the tone. The meeting ended with laughter, handshakes, and quiet optimism. Later that night, as he walked home, snow began to fall lightly around him. The streets were quiet, the air cold but calm. He thought about how much had changed in a year, how something that once filled him with fear had turned into something that gave his life deeper meaning. He knew the world wasn't fixed. There would always be mistakes, fear, and misunderstanding. But he also knew that one apology, one act of forgiveness could ripple farther than anyone expected. As he stepped inside his house, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the officer again. "Thank you for today. I never thought my job would lead me here, but I'm grateful it did." He smiled and typed back, "We're both still learning." That's what matters. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and steady. Inside, warmth filled the air, and for the first time, he didn't think of that night as something to forget. He thought of it as a story still being written, one where pain turned into purpose, and strangers learned to see each other not as enemies, but as human beings trying their best to do better. Time has a quiet way of healing things, not by erasing what happened, but by softening the edges around the memories. The town was different now, not perfect, but changed. The streets felt calmer. People had learned to talk to each other again. Even the smallest gestures, a wave, a smile, a kind word, seemed to mean more than they used to. The man who once sat behind a shattered window had grown into a new version of himself. He had become a speaker, a mentor, and in many ways a symbol of hope. But to him, he was still just an ordinary person trying to live right, take care of his family, and keep faith in the goodness of people. Some mornings, he still thought about that night. The sound of the breaking glass, the rush of confusion, the sting of fear. But instead of bitterness, he now felt a quiet strength. He had survived it, learned from it, and helped others because of it. It no longer felt like a wound, more like a scar that reminded him how far he had come. The officer's journey had been no less difficult. After months of counseling, training, and reflection, he had slowly regained the trust of his community. He didn't expect forgiveness from everyone, but he earned respect through consistency. He showed up, he listened, and he never hid from his past. Every few weeks, the two men still met, sometimes at a small cafe downtown, sometimes on a park bench near the lake. They would sit quietly, drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things and family, work, weather, the small changes they noticed around town. One afternoon, as they sat by the water, the officer said softly, "You know, sometimes I still think about leaving the force, starting over somewhere else." The man looked at him thoughtful. "Why?" "Because I'll always be remembered for that night," the officer said. "No matter how much good I do, it's the first thing people think about." The man nodded slowly. "Maybe that's true, but you can also decide what comes after that memory. People will remember what you did next, how you changed, how you treated others after that. You can't rewrite the first chapter, but you can decide how the story ends." The officer smiled faintly. "You always know how to put things in perspective." "I just learned to stop running from what hurt me," the man said. That's when healing really started. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunlight ripple across the lake. The world felt peaceful in that moment, quiet and kind. A few months later, the community center organized a large event called the Day of Unity. It was meant to bring people from all sides together, families, teachers, officers, and local leaders, to celebrate how far the town had come. The two men were asked to close the event with a talk about their journey. When the day arrived, the air buzzed with excitement. Children played near the stage, parents chatted in small circles, and music filled the background. It wasn't about politics or headlines anymore. It was about people, ordinary people who wanted to live in peace. When it was time for them to speak, the man stepped onto the stage first. He looked around at the faces, familiar, kind, curious, and took a slow breath. "I used to think forgiveness was something you gave to others," he began. "But I've learned that forgiveness is something you give yourself. It's what lets you move forward instead of getting stuck in the same pain." He paused, his voice gentle but firm. "We all make mistakes. Some we can fix, some we can't. But if we're willing to learn and grow, then even the hardest moments can lead to something good." Then the officer stepped forward. His tone was humble, almost quiet. "That night was the worst moment of my life," he said. "Not because of what people said about me, but because of what I saw in myself. Fear, pride, assumptions. I let those things guide my actions. And I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." He took a deep breath. "But that moment also became the start of something else. A chance to do better, to understand more, to change how I see people. I can't erase the past, but I can make sure it keeps teaching me for the rest of my life." The crowd was silent. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others simply nodded. It wasn't a moment of drama, it was one of truth. Real, quiet truth that touched hearts without shouting. After the speech, they stepped down together, shaking hands with people who came to thank them. An older man said, "You two give me hope for my grandkids." A teenager said, "You made me believe people can change." Each word felt like another piece of healing, not just for them, but for everyone there. That evening, after the event ended, they walked through the park one last time before parting ways. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. "You know," the officer said, "when I first knelt that night, I thought I'd never be able to stand again. Not in the same way. But now I realize kneeling wasn't weakness. It was the first step toward standing right." The man smiled quietly. "Maybe that's what growth really looks like. Knowing when to stand and when to bow." They laughed softly, sharing the kind of calm that comes only after a long, difficult journey. A few weeks later, the officer decided to apply for a new position within the department, one focused on community engagement and reform. He wanted to help train new recruits to make sure they understood not just the law, but the heart behind it. When he got the job, the first person he called was his friend. "That's good news," the man said over the phone. "You're going to make a real difference there." "I hope so," the officer said. "This time I want to do it right." "You already are." As for the man, he continued his own work, mentoring young people, guiding them through challenges, teaching them how to handle fear and frustration with calmness instead of anger. He didn't preach. He just shared stories, listened, and cared. People respected him not because of what had happened to him, but because of what he became afterward. His quiet strength inspired others to see beyond anger, to believe in second chances. One afternoon, as he was leaving the center, he noticed a young man sitting on the steps, looking troubled. He sat down beside him and asked gently, "Rough day?" The young man nodded. "I got into an argument with a teacher. I feel like no one listens." He smiled softly. "I used to feel that way too. But sometimes people don't need to agree to understand you. You just have to stay calm long enough for them to hear your heart." The young man looked up at him and asked, "Did that work for you?" He nodded. "Eventually, yes. It took time. But it worked." The boy smiled faintly. "Then maybe I'll try again." "Good," he said. "That's where change starts. Trying again." As the boy left, he sat there for a while, watching the sunset. The world was still full of problems, but in that moment it felt a little better, a little more hopeful. He thought about how one small mistake had set everything in motion, the pain, the apology, the understanding that followed. What once felt like an ending had turned into a beginning neither of them could have predicted. He smiled to himself, whispering under his breath, "Sometimes, life breaks you just enough to rebuild you stronger." That night, as he walked home, the streetlights glowed softly. The same roads that once carried fear now felt like pathways of peace. He passed by the place where everything had happened, the same corner, the same stretch of road. For a moment he stopped, looking at it quietly. He no longer felt anger or sadness, and only gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons, the growth, and the strange friendship that had come from it all. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to life itself. Then he turned and kept walking, step by steady step into a future that felt lighter, brighter, and full of quiet promise.